Flex your business with an American Express Business Gold Card. You'll earn 4 times membership rewards points on your top 2 eligible spending categories, like transit and electronics, each month, on up to $150K in combined purchases per year. Plus, you can now earn 3 times membership rewards points on flights and prepaid hotels booked on AmexTravel.com. Terms and points cap apply. Learn more at AmericanExpress.com/business-gold. Amex Business Gold, built for business by American Express.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
I think he mentions degloving in it, but he doesn't go into explicit detail of how that actually works.
My knees are weak at the moment.
And what the film does
Can we?
is it shows it.
I know. And I was like, they're going to cut away. No, they're not cut. There it goes. Oh, there it goes. This is episode 104.
Hey everybody, and welcome to this episode of Flixwatcher podcast. Today we are joined by Miriam.
Hi.
Gareth.
Hello there.
And as always, Helen.
Hello.
And we're going to be talking about the Stephen King adaptation, Gerald's Game. I hope you enjoy the show, guys. Remember, please visit us online at flixwatcher.tv. Come to our Twitter account at flixwatcherpod, and please go to iTunes, subscribe and review.
There will be spoilers and bad language. You have been warned. Hello, film fans. Welcome to this episode of Flixwatcher Podcast. In our studio today, we have Gareth and Miriam. If you would like to say hello to our listeners and tell the listeners how you know me and Kobe and sort of your film interests, please.
Well, I know you guys through being a part of the awesome Shabbos Rollers, our film quiz.
Whoop, whoop.
My interest in films.
Gareth doesn't like whooping.
Won't do it.
I think we should do some more whooping.
No, I need an
coordinated
intensive whooping workshop.
Save it for the quiz.
I was out watching films for a long time when I had 2 little kids, and a few years ago with the Netflix subscription, I thought I should finally get to grips with my appalling film history viewing. And so I went about it fairly systematically. I went through like 150 of the best horror movies, one after the other, and various lists I found on Telegraph and The Guardian for best films on Netflix at any one time, and therefore sort of had a very intensive film education. And from that was able to work out a little bit about what I do or don't like.
So what do you or don't you like?
Well, I like certain kinds of horror films. Maybe not Gerald's Game, but we'll get to that.
Oh.
Particularly anything with ghosts and ghoulies. I like psychological thrillers. Not very much of a fan of rom-coms, although my husband loves them, which makes for a difficult
Those Netflix choices are going to be interesting.
Yeah.
He's a crier, so he'll be weeping within the first 15 minutes.
So do you know our top scoring film is When Harry Met Sally?
Oh, it's dreadful.
What? Well, it's a good job you weren't in the booth recording that day. You know,
well, I used to love it when I first saw it the first couple of times, and I rewatched it recently, and it was great for the first half, and then I think it sort of falls down the toilet after that. But such a terrible set of cliches.
So this might be the thing. I think it instilled a lot of those cliches.
It creates them.
Yeah.
Then we use them afterwards.
So I think when we were talking about during that recording, when myself and Helen and everyone else in the recording watched it the first time, we were a bit too young to understand what was going on. And then as we watched it more getting older, we're like, okay, these make sense. So you then saying there's like another end where it kind of falls off a cliff.
She's just so unappealing. I can't imagine why anyone would fall in love with her. And he's a bit of a twat. I do like the other couple, but
Carrie Fisher.
Everyone loves those.
Of course, that works. But I just wish they would go away and never
come back.
Well, luckily we're not reviewing that one today.
But you can listen to it if you want to, guys. Gareth, who are you?
Who am I? It's a question I ask myself a lot. I'm Gareth. I know you guys from the same quiz team that Miriam just mentioned. And I suppose my love of film started as a very lonely and bored teenager. That was my escape, was finding movies that I could watch and imagine a more interesting life.
Where are you from? Just to...
South Yorkshire. Glamorous, exciting South Yorkshire. Yeah, that gets a whoop. And I very quickly got into horror movies. I think, there's the movies that you watch when your parents plonk you down in front of the TV, and then there's the movies that you find yourself drawn to. And I think from about the age of 12 onwards, it was horror for me, both written horror and movie horror. But my tastes are fairly broad.
For horror?
Well, no, actually for all movies. I've got
a
kind of fairly extensive... Can I say fairly? That's probably underselling it. I have an extensive collection, and probably the only genre I don't care for is westerns.
I think I'll dip in. I think it's like with me with horror. I don't really care for horror, but if someone says this is a good film, Get Out, A Quiet Place, then I'll happily watch it. I think if there's a good western, then I'll happily watch it, as long as the story's not about being a western. It's about something else that's happening in the... We have this kind of discussion on our WhatsApp group quite often, don't we?
We do.
Yeah.
I think my problem, particularly with westerns, is aesthetically they all feel very similar to me. Whereas at least horror, you can have, something like Peter Jackson's Brain Dead over at one end, or Hellraiser on the other, or a Nightmare on Elm Street, or a Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They've all got very different aesthetics, very different moods and tones. Whereas westerns are all generally kind of
dusty,
aggressively macho, dusty, and far too many horses.
Women in them.
No, unless they're horse.
Unless they're
victims.
horse, yeah.
Occasionally a nun.
Yeah. I mean, I don't like horses either, so maybe that's westerns just not for me.
To not like westerns.
No, horses bore me. I can't look at horses.
How well has South Yorkshire been represented on film, other than the Full Monty
and Kes?
Okay, all right, there you go.
Yeah, and also there's another one. Funnily enough, it's a horror movie called When the Lights Went Out. And it's a really interesting Yorkshire take on paranormal activity or Amityville horror. It's about an actual documented haunting that took place. And the writer-director, whose name escapes me, was a friend of the family who were haunted. Right. And it's set in a little council estate in Yorkshire that feels very familiar to me. Like, I went to school with kids who lived on an estate exactly like, I know what those houses are like inside and out, and it's actually a pretty good film, and it represents Yorkshire.
Cool.
Let's not forget Rita, Sue and Bob too.
That's a different kind of horror.
Is that Yorkshire though?
Definitely.
It's most absolutely Yorkshire. Yeah.
Right. Cool. All right, Gareth, we're here talking today about your film, your choice, which is Gerald's Game.
That's right.
Can you give us a 2-minute synopsis and tell us why you brought it to the table?
Yeah,
the hot box, as I've just decided to call it.
The hot box.
Pretty warm in here today.
It's mild so far. We'll see how we get in half an hour. Gerald's Game is the story of a man and wife who go to their holiday cabin by the lake, supposedly to reignite a bit of passion that's dying in their relationship. But as we quickly discover, she's not that into it. And his attempts to try and reignite the passion kind of reveal a little bit more about the sort of person he is than she perhaps realised. Their opening overtures to sex don't go particularly well, and he dies quite quickly on. That's not a spoiler, that's kind of the point of the film. He dies, and she finds herself rather awkwardly handcuffed to the bed. And the rest of the film is really a story of, will she find the internal resolve to get herself out of this situation, or will she go mad and die? And
we'll discuss
it.
We'll discuss where she goes. So why did you choose it for us?
I chose it because there are a handful of films out there that are adaptations of books that are described as unfilmable. Films
have you read this book before?
I have. I read it when it first came out. Like I said earlier, I was a big Stephen King fan, and I read it. And we can talk about Stephen King later if you like. But what was interesting to me when I read the book is it came out in, I think, 1992, and Stephen King wrote 3 books in the early 90s, and a lot of critics and literary reviewers viewed this stage of his writing career as Stephen King's and I'm waiting for Mim's reaction to this, but they called it his feminist awakening. Some people there we go. Some people have attributed it actually to his daughter Naomi coming out as a lesbian at around that time. But it was very interesting that all of his books up to that point, with the exception of Carrie, which was his debut, had a very male focus, and he wrote 3 books in succession that took on a very female protagonist point of view, all of which addressed issues of abuse. So there was Gerald's Game, there was Dolores Claiborne, and there was Rose Madder, and they work as a sort of trilogy of books. Gerald's Game and Dolores Claiborne were actually written as one book, and then they were split into 2, and that's why the eclipse figures in both of them.
Right.
And they were going to be published as a kind of dual volume, and then his publishers thought, actually, we can split them out and make twice as much money. And then he wrote Rose Madder, which is less effective as a story. It's still interesting and worth reading, but Gerald's Game was the interesting one because it's such a tight concept. Woman handcuffed to bed, will she escape? And as a writer, I know that Stephen King has this thing that he likes to challenge himself with called the could ya, which means could you get out of it? So he'll write himself into a scenario where it's almost an impossible situation to find a way out, and he challenges himself as a writer to find a solution. And this book is full of those little moments. A scenario is set, it's like an escape room. It's what's the setup? How can you possibly get out of it? And then how do you tell that story? And so I really loved how tight a narrative it was. But like I said, the challenge is, how do you make a film of it? Because a woman chained to a bed sounds like the worst kind of torture porn. And also, all the book takes place in an interior monologue between a bunch of different personalities in the lead character Jessie's head, as she kind of runs through her past and other situations that she's found herself in. And that doesn't work as a film because...
It's not cinematic.
It's not cinematic at all. And it's...
I think that many films have struggled trying to portray it in a monologue somehow in a film.
Yeah, and it's really hard. And I think Mike Flanagan, who wrote and directed Gerald's Game, just came up with a really elegant solution for that without necessarily overcomplicating it. So he kept all of the core aspects of the story and just simplified some of its execution so it made more sense. And it's anchored by a really amazing performance. Carla Gugino is incredible in this film.
I love the gooch.
Yes.
Miriam, what did you think?
I have to admit, from the opening scenes, I hated it from beginning to end.
From the start?
Right from the start. This kind of horror genre is not one I'm massively keen on. It did feel a bit like a kind of torture porn light.
You want torture porn heavy?
I don't want torture porn at all. It felt like a strange made-for-TV, soft focus, abuse adjacent, badly acted, heavily dressed.
Oh,
Sorry, heavily dressed?
Don't hold back.
No, please, but I mean, go for it.
In terms of it just felt like you could almost see whoever dressed that scene was hiding around the corner. It just looked too perfect. And there was so much focus on the prettiness of Jessie's face in and out. And it just felt like it wasn't very authentic. I didn't believe it. I didn't believe her. And the inner monologue, which was well done, in the sense that they obviously have 2 actors doing it. One is her. It just was full of exposition. It was all signposted miles ahead, so you knew exactly what was going to happen. The child abuse was totally expected. I wasn't at all surprised. And the only thing that kept my interest was the could you? Like, how would I have got out of this situation? And the whole way through I was thinking, but surely she can just break the bedpost. It can't be. That's got to be easier than what actually happened. And that's what I was thinking about. Otherwise, I just wanted to die as quickly as possible so I could get to the end of this film.
I was just going to say, before we go any further, if you have got any interest in watching this film, then you should probably watch it, because we will probably be giving away the ending or indicating
we'll be giving away
spoilers.
the picture.
Yeah, so stop listening now. I quite enjoyed this.
Did it surprise you?
Well, the reviews had been very strong, and Gareth had talked about it very fondly already. And Stephen King sort of track record is very good, and I'd heard generally good reviews of it. I mean, it shouldn't work because it is basically one person in a room for nearly an hour, but the way it's directed, I really enjoyed how the inner voices are represented, and kind of how you sort of move through that journey of her mind playing tricks on her, what's real, what's not real. It's got a fair amount of gore. I particularly enjoyed the bits with the dog. That's a fun character. It's kind of got this slight supernatural element to it as well. I mean, I guess there is going to be some kind of trauma that happened early on to affect her relationship with her husband, and that reveal will come on.
Is that a bit of a trope though for films or stories that the woman has to have suffered to? But
it's a different kind of abuse. It's maybe not the obvious one that everyone goes for, but I mean, that didn't detract from. I was say enjoy my film, how much I enjoyed this film about. No, sure. But as a horror film, it wasn't a negative aspect for me.
I think I enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I was going to. That's the main kind of overarching theme here. But for me, I was kind of confused. Initially I thought it was going to be a nice kind of tight two-hander. I hadn't read the book. And I thought, actually, this could play. I'd like to see how this would play out as a two-hander. And then when they started to bring these other narrative strands, which bring in the abuse storyline, which I guess has to feature, but then they kind of took away from me. And then also the story about the big tall person, was he there? Was he not there? That also took away from what could have been a nice tight thing. But then I think the film would have brought itself into its own kind of kudja of how do you make this film work. And I like the way that the internal dialogue was played off between Carla Gugino and her husband, Bruce Greenwood. I liked how that played. I liked how they did that. I thought that was really a nice, clever way to do that. And I think if it somehow managed to play the film like that in the way that we really loved Ex Machina, for example, as a tight 2-3-hander film, I would have loved that a lot more. But when it just kind of strayed away from there, it just kind of lost it for me a bit.
There's a couple of things that are really interesting about it. Firstly, there's one major change that they make
to the storyline
in the film, to the storyline.
From the book.
And it seems like a very, on the surface, it's almost inconsequential. It's actually hugely important. In the book, he is trying to initiate sex with her, and she is resisting, and she knees him in the groin, which is why he has a heart attack and dies. And as he has a heart attack, he falls back and he breaks his neck, and that's what kills him. And
who knew that kicking in the groin would have that effect?
Well, who knew? Exactly. But what was interesting is the fact that the narrative in the film shifts culpability. He just has a heart attack almost.
Shouldn't have been popping those blue pills.
No, exactly. And that's the addition, is that Viagra didn't exist when Stephen King wrote the book. And I wonder whether he might tell the story differently if he was writing it now. But taking away her agency in causing his death, even though she doesn't intend to kill him, she just wants him off her because she's not into what he's trying to create. But that, for me, is a really interesting difference. In the book as well, she's naked. So they're already starting to have sex and she's naked. And I think that would have made this a very, very... and that was one of the reasons why this seemed unfilmable, is you can't have a naked woman chained to a bed for an hour and a half. There's just something unpleasantly voyeuristic about the whole idea of it. So the fact that she's in a nightgown, where it's her attempt at trying as well, changed the role of her character in the setup. And just, it's interesting that that's how they chose to make it slightly different from the book, rather than actually changing the plot per se, because everything else that happens is pretty much as it happens in the book, except in the book it's her multiple personalities.
Not including the husband's point of view.
In fact, the husband's point of view is very minimal in the book. It's basically her having a dialogue with different versions of herself through her life. And I think the other point I wanted to come back to about the abuse is, I think when you get to the end of the film, and funnily enough, I think one of the things the film does really well is it lands at the point of the story almost more clearly than the book does, because the book isn't about really, the story isn't about a woman chained to a bed. It's not about the kudya. That's just to keep the narrative going.
That's the MacGuffin, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is the MacGuffin, because the reason King wrote it and the point he wanted to make with it, and the reason he wrote Dolores Claiborne as well, is he wanted to write two stories about women who have experienced abuse throughout their lives and the actions they take to free themselves from whatever the monster is. The monster becomes metaphorical, and that's what the story's about. So when I read the book, when I was 17, I didn't get all the metaphors. And actually, when I read it, as someone who likes Stephen King for the horror, the moment the actual horror was introduced in this spooky Moonlight Man, it was a genuinely terrifying thing to read in the book. I remember getting goosebumps all up my neck, and it was really, really creepy. But I kind of felt cheated, like
in the film.
In the book.
Okay.
As a teenager, I felt like he'd thrown in some horror because that's what he was known for. And actually, I'd found the rest of the book so compelling, I didn't need the horror. And it felt like this, and it goes really gruesome. I mean, it's the whole Ed Gein story. It's the teeth and the bones and the body parts and the exhumed corpses and all of that. And it's really like extremely grim for something that's been, you could almost imagine it working quite well as a two-hander play on a stage. That degree of horror I just felt was unnecessary. In the film, they managed to soften some of that detail and amp up what the film's really about, which is the men in her, like, funnily enough, so this is just an aside point. I don't know if you saw Mark Kermode's show at Christmas about Christmas movies.
No.
It was really good. And he talked a lot about A Christmas Carol and how A Christmas Carol is a model that's been applied time and time again to all sorts of Christmas movies. I was thinking about it this morning, and the thought that suddenly hit me is that the three men in Jessie's story are like the past, the present, and the future. The past is her father, the present is her husband, and the future is this creepy Moonlight Man that's sitting in the corner of the room. She's experienced different kinds of abuse twice in her life, and her fear is that the third one, the future one, is going to be the one that does her in.
And that's why she has to face it at the end.
She has to face it, and that's how she's able to confront him and say, "You're so much smaller than I remember." To me, that's a powerful piece of storytelling.
What did you guys make of the Moonlight Man?
I thought the Moonlight Man worked pretty well as a manifestation of her psychosis, as she is deprived of water and food, and as a sort of symbol of everything that's toxic about masculinity. And I wished it would have kept as a figment of her imagination. I think you could have done so much more with that. And I actually thought at first that this must be a deviation from the book, and you couldn't possibly have meant it to be an actual serial killer who was coming in and out of our house, because as a metaphor, it works well. You don't know whether it's real or not. You assume that it isn't. And her dialogue with him seems to have that sort of very unreal quality that you would expect of someone in that sort of situation. Yeah, including her interaction with him when she finally escapes. And then it feels like a whole different story is then happening when 6 months later she finds out it's the real person, and then she goes to see him in his trial and he talks to her, and he's almost like this sympathetic character at this point. And
he's
almost
like,
what's the point of him in this story?
That 6 month finish, really, I hate that in any kind of TV or film. Like, skip to the bit afterwards. And also when he turns around and says, "Oh, you're real." So it's like almost like whose story are we focusing on? Because
but that's him replaying what. That's not him saying that. He's saying
what she
reminding
said.
of what she said.
Yeah. But and this is like, I found that a bit jarring. And I agree. I think if it had stayed as that metaphorical kind of Moonlight Man, that would have made it a lot more interesting premise for me. Helen,
I kind of I thought the 6 months later was a bit clunky in its storytelling, but it needed to happen to show her journey. Otherwise, it would just be really depressing, and kind of the story wouldn't be complete. And I quite like the fact that you're imagining that he's this fictional character and he's a hallucination and it's really weird. And then you find out it's not. It makes it even creepier because he was there.
And didn't do anything.
Yeah. And he's mentioned at the start anyway. So
yeah, he's on the radio.
Yeah. So you're kind of like, okay, so that you were pointed to it there, and it's. I thought it was quite interesting, and it adds that. Like, ooh, it was real.
I mean, the reason I like it is because the whole conversation that the film is trying to, and the book as well, is trying to initiate is the things that we define as monsters can sometimes seem really prosaic and ordinary, and sometimes they can be almost fantastical, but the power we give to them as monsters is what determines their size and effectiveness. And you know, her father at the start is the most loving of the three monsters. He's caring and nurturing, but he's also, you know, an awful child molester. And at the end, you've got someone who's actually rather kind of pitiful and broken and damaged, but
who killed 8 people.
Who's an actual monster. He, you know, I like that because it throws up the main themes of the story, and it's imperfect because life is imperfect as well. But I found her performance in that confrontation scene in the court really. I like a story that has some closure, and you know it's slightly cheesy, but the eclipse thing at the end as she walks down the street, it's not literally an eclipse. It's some of her.
So you have the eclipse, but you also have. When she turns to see what the Moonlight Man looks like really, then it like fades into her husband and fades into her dad.
Yeah.
So that when you're talking about the 3 ghosts of Christmas past, present, and yet to come kind of thing, that's embodied in that.
She's
shot
literally facing all of her monsters in one go.
in one go.
But
and
of all the exposition in this film, most of it is about the men. I know almost nothing about her apart from this one incident when she's 12. And then it's all about how terrible her husband is and her father. I don't know anything about what happened to her while she was married, or what the background was. Or
we get to know about her during her resolve in the film. But
I know everything about her character. I might not know her backstory.
I don't know anything about her character. She is a complete blank to me.
Oh, I felt like I learned an awful lot, because that's always the challenge, particularly with female characters in movies, particularly movies that tend to be written by men, is what do you know about the character other than her relation to a husband or the boyfriend? But to me, it's all about her reactions. It's about her resolve. It's about there's naivete and innocence about wanting to feed the dog. She feels sorry for it, but she doesn't realise that the steak was really expensive. And she leaves the door open and she's anxious about that. She wants to please her husband, but she sort of doesn't trust him. And she's also uncomfortable with his attempt to, you know, reignite their sex. I feel like I know a lot about her. She's complicated and nuanced, and I don't know what she does for a living, but that's not what the story's about. I don't know what Gerald does for a living.
He's a lawyer.
He's a lawyer, and she's
like her father.
She's a housewife, even though
without many friends.
The resolve, the kudja. Let's talk about that, guys. Should we go to? Let's go
to talk about her husband, because
we are going on for time here talking about it. So let's move on.
I was just going to say, in terms of villains, he's particularly nasty and really kind of more scary than the Moonlight Man, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you get
her husband or her dad.
Her husband. I think what you see in her dad is just how easy it is to manipulate someone. There's a really,
because he talks her out of telling her mother.
Because he makes her feel like it will be her fault. And I thought that was a really well-written demonstration of how abusers tend to manipulate their victims. I thought that was really quite
because I thought that was
well done.
I thought that was the best bit about that line of the storytelling when he's I'm so sorry. Let's we could tell your mum, but hold on, it will be
because I think
she'll blame you.
It's something that was a little more cliche. It would be the hand over the mouth. It would be the threat. It would be something a little bit kind of bullshitty and obvious. Yeah. And I think that just showed a much more sophisticated understanding of how people manipulate each other. I think to Helen's point, Gerald is a really awful person, and you start to realise just how awful. It starts with the handcuffs and his kind of him wanting her to play into a rape fantasy. and her dawning disgust as she realizes what he's actually trying to create there.
I think it's the fact he doesn't accept that she doesn't want to be a part of it. Because if both people are entangled in the same fancy, then, go to town. But the fact at the first instance, she wasn't comfortable and he didn't, and yet he kept on going.
Yeah.
And he'd never talked to her about it beforehand.
Yeah.
What was
And
going
it's
to
like,
happen.
where
And he
did
brought
this
these
come from?
industrial strength handcuffs, so couldn't possibly get out.
But then we find out in the discussion that he has actually kind of had those, if she thought back about it, then he has had those kind of leanings beforehand.
But also there's that lovely moment where they're in the car on the way there and the song's on the radio and it's a trigger for her. And so that's a thing that sets her up into that just remembering and then the eclipse becomes metaphorical about her blanking out her history and not thinking about it and trying to throw herself into a marriage and a relationship and all of that. And the dawning realization of what she went through as a child and how she's almost falling into a pattern and that she now needs to initiate a change. I thought it was quite powerful.
Before we go into the denouement, the Kudja, how does this rank for us guys? I've never actually read a Stephen King book, but he has been prolifically made into films. Sometimes well, sometimes not so well. I mean, Dark Tower is one that's been lauded. I mean, last year was a big year for Stephen King.
It was,
yeah.
It's Dark Tower, this, I'm not sure if there's anything else that came out, but how does this rank in the pantheon of Stephen King films that we...
Pretty high for me.
It doesn't rank at all.
Well, what would be the peak for you? Peak
Probably
King?
The Shining.
Okay.
Mim and I have had conversations about The Shining before. That's
But
a whole
also
separate
Carrie.
podcast.
Yeah.
Carrie's up there. Because I love the book and because I was so excited to see what Mike Flanagan would do with this, I think it's probably in my top 5.
Okay.
But it's up there with some... actually the new adaptation of It would go in there with Carrie, Shawshank Redemption.
Yeah.
And I don't know about the 5th one.
I think I'd be the Shawshank guy. And that's me not knowing Stephen King and not really being
Stand By
horror.
Me. That would be the 5th one.
That's a great film.
There you go.
Great film.
Those two would be my top 3. Right, guys,
Bring the gore.
bring the gore.
Bring the glove.
Let's take away that glove. Had you ever heard of this term degloving before?
Yes.
And how?
Someone actually, it was years ago, someone shared something on, I think
Already
it was on
it sounds-
social media, and
already
it
it sounds
was
grim.
one of those gross, here are
Clutching
horrible
my
things
hands.
that people see in hospitals.
Yeah.
And it was described as
Motorbike people have them
yes,
in a motorbike accident.
yeah, and I saw the picture before I realised what I was looking at, and then I wished I hadn't seen it.
Yeah.
And as practical effects go, this is among the best I've
is.
ever seen. It's
This
really quite.
This is genuinely one of the times I wasn't sick, but I was found it really.
I did think of
really
you
tough
when I was watching it. I was
Yeah.
going like, oh,
Yeah.
I
Kobe's
skipped
not
it.
going to enjoy this.
I've watched the film twice, and it's practically the only scene I can think of in any horror film where I've had to cover my eyes.
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how well it's done, but it's just almost unwatchably awful.
I
Yeah,
had to
I
send
heard-
Reese out of the room. He was like, what's happening in it now? I was like, you don't want to come in, don't come in. And he could hear it and he was like going, what's going on? I was like, you don't want to know.
Yeah.
I'd heard about degloving. There's a book which is really popular at the moment called
Stop
This
saying
Ought to
that
Hurt.
word.
This is going to hurt by
Yes.
a comedian.
Adam McKay.
Yeah,
McKay.
that's where I've...
That's why I first. I've not read the book because he talked about it on Richard Herring's podcast about degloving.
I mean, that's nothing.
And that for me was like, I don't want to hear it because I've heard about penile degloving as well, which
Yep.
Let's not go there.
yeah. So
And
for me, that's why I don't want to read this book.
it's amazing. You should read it.
No, but I don't want to read. I've seen him live, and I think he's amazing. But I don't want to read that because it's rank. So when I saw it live, when I realized what was happening, and it works really well. That, as you say, as a physical effect of gore, I'm not really afraid of gore. But
I was
a lot
surprised
of it
they
is
went
like
that
nonsense.
far.
Gore doesn't bother me at all.
Yeah.
I can watch, I mentioned Peter Jackson's Brain Dead earlier,
yeah.
which is the
That's-
goriest film ever made.
That's funny
Yeah,
though.
but that's
Gore doesn't-
it's like a cartoon.
Yeah, but gore and blood doesn't bother me. What sells this moment is the sound effects. It's the performance. It's the detail
Of like
it's,
putting the glass into the wedge in the shelf, so that she.
and it's the anticipation as well, because you know the moment you know what she's going to do, you're like,
Yeah.
oh, will it work?
Yeah.
But I
At first, I thought it was just like lubricate, get some blood coming out so you can maybe slip it through. But then no, we're going to take it
So,
further.
given how fond Stephen King is of writing truly gruesome scenes, from what I recall of having read the book, the detail is more on the slitting of the wrists,
Right.
and then the using of the blood as a lubricant. And I think he mentions degloving in it, but he doesn't go into explicit detail of how that actually works.
My knees are weak at the moment.
And
by the
what
way,
the
guys.
film does
Can we?
is it shows it.
I know.
Finish this, please.
And I was like, they're going to cut away. No, they're not cut. There it goes. Oh, there it goes.
And the closest example in Stephen King's other work is the hobbling scene in Misery.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is
Also
almost
one I can't watch.
equally unwatchable, even
Also,
though
it's a great
it's
film.
half a second. And that was actually, at the time, there was a real concern, and Stephen King wasn't happy with it, because in the book, she cuts his foot off with an axe. But the hobbling is somehow at once less graphic, but so much more horrifying. We've seen limbs severed a million times in movies, but just that grotesque twist of the ankle. I remember when I watched that first, it made my sister cry because it was so horrifying and quick. Your imagination kind of fills in the rest, and it's a pain that you can imagine.
I thought I would be okay with this, having watched Martyrs and enjoyed it with the whole peeling of the entire body. But that was more artistic, I felt, than this one.
And weirdly, Martyrs doesn't seem to focus on the... I didn't get the pain from Martyrs because I've never been skinned alive. I almost don't... I imagine there's a point where your nerve endings just shut down because it's overwhelming. The scene in Gerald's game is localized enough for you to think, I can sort of imagine how horrifyingly painful that is, and that's what makes it
And then the mobile phone
almost unwatchable.
battery is dead.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy road to
get out from
freedom,
that situation then.
But yeah. And on that,
On that bombshell. Maybe I shouldn't ask this, but in the pantheon of horrible scenes you've witnessed in film, the one that comes to me the most is in American History X.
The curb stomp.
Curb stomp scene. Even though you don't see that, that's not as graphic as this.
No.
But that for me is one of those scenes where I'm literally jump up and have to like hold myself.
So Tom Savini, the effects guy who did the effects in the Romero zombie movies and Friday the 13th and Maniac and all of those, Tom Savini talks about doing great special effects using misdirection. He works effects tricks the way a magician does. So you show something real to let the audience know that you're seeing something real, and then you can swap it out and do something fake, and their brain remembers that they've seen, like, the blade has a real metal edge, so you hear it chink against something, so you know it's real. So even then when you see the dummy one, your brain is convinced it's still seeing the same thing. And what American History X does incredibly well is that sound effect of the teeth on the curb.
That's the thing, isn't it?
So once you see that, there's a real teeth on a real curb, and you know what that sounds like when your teeth graze against a hard surface. And from that moment on, it doesn't matter how much you do or don't see. You know that there are real teeth on a real curb. Everything else you can just fill in the gaps, and that's what makes it so horrifying.
Well, that was what Dali did in his film, and Chien
Andalou.
Yeah, with the eyeball, the first example of that.
But that was a cow's eye, wasn't it?
Used. But you meant to think it's a
human eye. Anything for you, Mim, that sticks out?
In terms of gore,
yeah,
I try not to, as a fainter, I try not to watch too much of that because I'll just fall off the back of my seat.
But if you're just going through the Times or IMDb 150 films, you're not picking it by gore level.
I think so much of it, it doesn't have a visceral effect because it seems like a cartoon. Heads exploding, brain dead was a fantastic example of that. I just couldn't take it seriously. We're not supposed to.
It's almost like
and the same with the zombie ones. In fact, I kind of enjoyed, zombies pulling out guts from people's bodies and whatnot. It's a quick death, so you haven't got that long drawn out pain that you get in this one. But as I say, I try not to. I inveterately I just close my eyes when this sort of stuff comes along.
Right.
I go la 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 la, so I don't have to listen to the sound effects either.
Anything else for you, Gareth? Is that?
No, I think we've covered it.
Cool. Right, guys, let's head to the scores.
Time for the scores. So, welcome to the spreadsheet of dreams. So, all the scores are out of 5. You can have decimal places, and the lowest you can go is 0, no minuses. And we will start with you, Gareth, with the recommendability, please.
I think I'd say a 4 because I know it's not for everybody. There'll be some people who either need a little more bang for their buck or they're just too squeamish to enjoy something like that. So I think 4 is fair.
Miriam?
I'm going to give it a 3 because although I hated it with a visceral passion, I know that everyone's got different tastes and there will be a lot of people who will enjoy it.
I am also going to go for a 4. I think it's a pretty solid horror film, and if you're a fan of Stephen King and horror, I would definitely recommend it. And yeah, it's a 4 because, it is pretty gruesome, and
that's why you're taken away from it.
The one that loses the mark because
of the gruesome.
Yeah,
okay.
Even casual horror fans might find it a bit too much.
I'm going to give it more points because of the gore to take it up to 3.4. I'm going to say because I know people who will like it, and I think they will, and that scene will shock people, and I think that's one thing. That's one reason you should see it. And I was expecting something to happen. I thought she was going to have to break her arm or something like that. All of which wouldn't have hit me in the same way that did, and I applaud the film for it. But I still don't think, for me, it's not my kind of film. The people I recommend it to, I'd say probably would have watched this already, or say, yeah, go for the.
Yeah, we've seen it.
So that's why it's a bit lower for me. But I'm adding more because I think that scene was genuinely one of the few things that's maybe turned away from the screen, and I think that's great. That's absolutely great. Repeat viewing score. Gareth, how many times have you seen it so far?
I've seen it twice, and it's been around for about 14 months. I would happily watch it again because I like the depths that it goes to. But then again, it's a fairly small film. It's trying to come up with a lot of interesting camera angles in what is effectively one room, which is probably, I think, why Mim thought it was over art directed. Because it was very consciously trying to create some different viewpoints in one set. It's one bed. The head of the bed is actually, I don't know if you noticed this, but the head of the bed is actually the mirror from Oculus.
Oh, is it? Okay.
You're joking.
No. Well, it's the same director, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's that mirror. Well, that mirror's been in virtually every movie he does.
It's a great bed as well.
It's great, yeah. But all those curly cues and things, that's from.
I took a lot of notice of those as I was trying to work out
it's
how
great,
to possibly.
Great detail. So, repeat viewing, I'm going to score this a 4 because for a movie with only a handful of actors and one set, I'd be quite happy to watch it again.
Well, I'd be very happy never to watch it again, so I'm going to give it a 1.
H?
It's an hour and 43. I could probably have done with 15 minutes shaved off that to be my ideal runtime. I probably would watch it again. Don't know why.
What situation would you watch it again? Because the way you're kind of saying it is that I probably would watch it again, but I have to be like had 3 pints of like Stella Artois and
maybe just a night in on my own, flicking through Netflix and can't be bothered to find something new.
Nice
and
chick flick.
Yeah.
thought I might go back to that one for a bit of.
Just want to give myself nightmares.
Degloving fun.
Yeah, and then go straight to bed afterwards.
2.5.
2.5. I'm going to join Mim. In fact, I'm going to go for 0.9.
Can you do that?
That's very
Yeah, you
specific.
can put as many decimal places in as you want. So what do you say, 2.5?
Yeah. It's down the middle.
Yeah. All right. Small screen score. Gareth.
I have to give it a 5. It was made for Netflix, so it was made to be watched on a TV, and most people, I know when you position this, it's could you watch it on a tablet or a phone?
We talk about home viewing, so on a TV screen.
But it was made for that, but I still think it's suitably cinematic, but it's not something that demands to be seen on the biggest possible screen. Yeah. So I think it's perfectly suited to the small screen.
Miriam?
I'd agree. It looked fine on the small screen. In fact, I can't quite imagine it on a larger screen.
The smaller the better, though.
Yeah. Diminishing to the point
on an Apple Watch.
So I'm going to give it a 4. Because it would definitely works best on that medium.
Well, you even said it almost felt like a TV movie when you were watching it.
Yeah. kind of soft focus.
I'll go for a 5 on this one. I like the fact that it's a Netflix one, and they're kind of dipping their toe into
dipping
the hoe into gore, dipping their toes into putting money behind this. And I think obviously with the TV series as well, the Haunting of Hill House, they've obviously got quite a few rewards back from endorsing Mr. Flanagan. So and it does have, and not in a bad way for me, has that kind of slightly low budget feel, even though it is sort of cinematic in places.
I'm going to go 4.5 here. I'm taking half away because going back to that degloving scene, I think that would have been hilarious to see that in the cinema with other people. I like, that kind of reaction you see with people. And the biggest reaction I've seen in the cinema screen was watching Drive, when literally like the whole road just like shot up. I don't know, and screamed when.
Yes, I know the scene.
And I was just like,
wow.
This is what like something that binds people could do. And I think it would be quite interesting to see, because I was in my bed, I was like trying to make myself look as small as possible and not look at the screen. So to watch what other people were doing, would have been quite interesting.
Weren't people like sick in the aisles and stories like that?
Sorry?
For watching this?
I think the publicity departments always like those stories. Don't they?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
Did he get any
there's
release?
some great news. There's some great news footage from when The Exorcist was released in '74, and it's hilarious because it's lots of people being carried out of the cinema, the ushers having to go in and wash the carpets because people were throwing up because they'd never experienced anything like it before. But again, the studio PR departments, like you say, they love those stories because it's like you're going to get something really extreme. The only time I've ever seen someone scream and run out of a cinema was actually watching Showgirls.
Oh, really?
Completely different
That's
reasons.
a whole different story.
4.5, because I think it would have been quite cool to see what people's reactions were. This is me being like freak show. It'd be like an eclipse. I wouldn't look at the.
Don't look directly
screen.
at it.
I wouldn't look at the screen. I just stand there at the screen looking back at everyone.
Maybe that's the point.
I think
That is the eclipse moment.
Yes, that's
Don't
your
look at
eclipse
it.
moment. Don't look directly at it.
look at people's reactions. Engagement score, Gareth.
Oh, sorry.
So, I mean, we're defining engagement as, it got me.
It got you. Did you feel the need to be like? Were you
look
like?
at your
I'm gonna.
phone?
I didn't look at my phone. It's one of those films. So my ultimate test for a film and how much I'm engaged in it is, do I wish it was a bit longer? And with this one, yeah.
Okay.
I know, to your point, Helen, you thought they could shave 15 minutes off it. I was enjoying it so much. I was like, this could happily go to 2 hours and I'd be completely happy. So yeah, I'll give it a 5.
Miriam.
I watched this film in 10-minute bursts. Watched a bit, stopped a bit, watched a bit.
Over how many days?
2 days.
Okay.
I did an hour each. It's an hour and 45 minutes. There were bits that I did find engaging. The flashbacks to the eclipse, I did manage to easily watch all the way through. But for the rest, I had to break it down into small bite-sized bits. So I would give it a 2, I think.
Crikey. I've never heard that before.
Breaking it down to like 10-minute bursts sounds like some weird kind of like cardio or fitness thing or
Like high intensity
torture
hit training.
I do think it was a little bit longer and it could have shaved bits here and there. But I was, for the most part, completely engaged, but a little bit sort of, come on then, is she going to get out? Is she not?
So there was
Before.
a driving through line for you.
But it did sag a little bit, so I thought it could just be a little bit tighter, so 4.5.
I'm going to give it a 3.5. I think it could have been a lot tighter. Just, I think the narrative, apart from the scene where she's talking to her dad and that's kind of inceptioning of like, no, this, if you tell your mum, she'll hate you kind of thing. I thought that was the best bit that was outside of the 4 walls of the story. So I think it could have been, for me, tighter. And everything else with the Moonlight Man at the end kind of just took me out of it completely. So that's why it's a bit lower than it would be. So 3.5 for me there, which gives us an overall score of 3.51875, which
Pretty good.
I think is decent.
Not bad.
Yeah.
I think the repeat viewing score, it's taken a few knocks there because it's a tough what
I can
if you know
imagine
what's
it'd
gonna
be a
happen.
film that most people wouldn't need to see more than once.
Unless you want to find out more about how to fold your clothes properly and pack. Good for that.
Or design a nice bedhead.
Oh, that's true. Actually, there was a lot of packing.
Or a
in,
nice
yeah.
loft.
How
or a
to
nice
pack
90.
some elongated handcuffs.
Can I just
Put them at the top of the.
can I just say one final thought?
Sure.
If
Like Jerry
you're-
Springer.
If you're tempted, this is a great film to watch as a double bill with Dolores Claiborne, because although the movie Dolores Claiborne doesn't mention it, Gerald's Game does. She has a moment where she sees a woman standing over a well, and in the two, but like I said earlier, the books are written together as one piece.
Yep.
The stories overlap, and the only supernatural element in Gerald's Game is actually her psychic connection with Dolores Claiborne. And what I loved about the film was they left that in there. If you've read the books and you know the connection, if you haven't, it doesn't matter. It's just a line of dialogue. But if you want to, Dolores Claiborne's another great Stephen King adaptation. And the fact that the characters are linked through this eclipse and overcoming abuse, it does make it two nice stories that sit nice, probably the wrong word. Two interesting stories that sit well together.
We asked people before we go to recording to comment on the films we're going to be talking about. In this case, we said we're reviewing Gerald's Game with My Mimskull and G. Dimolo. Have you seen it? Tell us your thoughts for an on-air shout-out on Flixwatcher. And we had a couple of people coming back to us, which did surprise me. Miriam, do you want to read the first one?
Broken Woman's... This one.
Yeah.
Really great performance by Carla Gugino.
Gugino.
Good, thank you.
And Gareth, do you want to take a
Oh,
second?
great. Give me the tongue twister. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So this is our friends at Top Film Tip. Broken woman slipping sanity aids escape from mental... that says metal.
I think he means mental. Does
Or
he?
it could be
Oh,
physically
yeah,
metal.
mental, yeah.
Metaphorical chains, bewitching battle for self-actualization. Like a snake, our protagonist sheds her skin to be born anew. Wholly masterful work of D-Glove red right hand storytelling.
All
He's
wrapped up in a
show-off.
maxi pad.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And he gives that 5 hands.
Out of
slash-
5 gloves.
Yes.
We should say Top Film Tip is our captain, my captain for Shabbos Rollers for our
Give
quiz
Ben
team.
a shout out. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Ben, for that. Guys, thank you very much for coming and bringing us the film, Gareth.
Thank
Can
you.
Do you want people to find you on Twitter? If you do, tell us
Absolutely.
where they can find you.
Just at Gudimolo. That's GDIMELOW.
And at My Mimsicle.
Sounds filthy. That's what I love.
That's the point.
Cool. Well, cheers for that, guys, and thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for
Thank
coming
you.
on.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Cheers, guys. You were just listening to the latest episode of Flixwatcher podcast. Thank you to Brendan Russell for his sublime editing skills, Mighty People for the tunes you can hear right now. Please do come to iTunes and find us, like, subscribe, share with your friends. Find us on Twitter at FlixWatcherPod and our website, flixwatcher.tv.